Beastcoast Pokemon. Today, the gang is all here to go over the recent Milwaukee Regional Championship that has happened. All the meta developments, the player development, all of that good stuff we'll be breaking down today. How's everyone doing?
Doing good.
Yeah, happy to be here. It's cool to talk about another big regional in the books.
It's weird because it feels like Worlds is just getting closer and closer. We only have one regionals left after Milwaukee in North America, with Fresno coming up, and then NAIC, and then it's Worlds. And obviously Worlds is going to be a completely different format, but I think it's been fun to watch the metagame adaptations of this format in particular. I think this weekend, by the way, the weekend that Milwaukee Regionals took place, there were multiple tournaments, and Orthworm had like a super dominating performance across the board. So it's really interesting to see the rise of that Pokemon in particular, which I'm sure we'll talk about in just a little bit.
Basically, the meta has kind of evolved rapidly, and a lot of cores I think has just picked up in usage, especially ever since like the previous regionals around the Hartford time. We've also had a lot of Asian nationals happen as well. There is a huge spike in a few teams. Specifically, I think we've seen a lot of like the Chi-Yu balance with like Gyarados, Iron Hands, Tinglu, Amoonguss, Flutter Mane, Gyarados. We saw a lot of, I think, at the recent regionals, as well as the Orthworm stuff that Aaron has mentioned before. We have seen the several variants do extremely well over the past few weeks.
I think Orthworm's kind of interesting as a development because the first time that I heard about Orthworm, it was in relation to Palafin balance, where basically Orthworm was in theory a counter team because the team had limited applications of its offensive Pokemon because Palafin and Arcanine couldn't start out the game offensively. Flutter Mane didn't match up well into Orthworm, and then Orthworm was immune to Tinglu. And it also resisted Excalibur's attack. So like I initially was thinking about Orthworm as kind of this catch-all against Palafin balance. So to me, what's really interesting about Orthworm is seeing it have, the best weekend it's ever had, while Palafin balance is really not the dominant composition anymore, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of surprising to look at that because Palafin balance sort of fell off of a cliff when you look at even maybe Azumarill as a Pokemon starting to take the Palafin's place. Just getting access to those fairy type attacks, I feel like it's been super valuable in this particular format. But even still, it is really weird to see how Palafin started out so dominant at the start of Regulation C and then has dropped off in popularity by a lot, and Orthworm still hanging on there. And also in different variations as well, like either playing in Trick Room or even just without it.
Yeah, to me, I think the main thing about Orthworm is it's not very common, but it has the ability to perform incredibly well. So I think if you're going to like Fresno Regionals or NAIC, you're probably not going to play more than maybe one or two Orthworms in Swiss, for example, in day one. But those Orthworms that you may run into, these top players who are piloting it are really, really good. We saw it win a special event over in Italy the same weekend as well. It's interesting looking at like the top 50 teams. I think there's only two Orthworm actually. So in terms of pure representation, there's not very much, but has the ability to go deep, and we've seen it evolve a little bit. I do want to take a step back and go back to the team that James was talking about, because 3 players in the top 8 of this tournament ended up bringing it. Brian Hume obviously won the entire tournament with it. Paul Chua got 4th place with it, and Justin Tane got 6th place with it. Wolf also used the same core to finish top 4 at the Hartford Regional Championship. So Wolf, you've had experience with the team. What do you think has really lent to this team rising in popularity, especially since it was something that we had seen some players bring to EUIC, but it feels like it's really taken off in the events afterward?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the version that I brought, I built independently. Like the team already existed before I built my version, but I reached it without like kind of even consulting the existing version. It just like, I understand why the Pokemon fit together very well, so I can explain that a little bit, even though what I brought, like the sets that I used were different. Like the team that Brian Yum won with, he had like Choice Specs Chi-Yu. I believe Justin Tang also did. I'm not positive about Paul Chua's specific sets, whereas mine was like Safety Goggles, and there was a couple other notable changes. I think that team tends to prefer like the Terra Fire Swords Dance Safety Goggles Iron Hands compared to my Terra Grass Leftovers. Basically, the general theory to me is that you have the Fire Water Grass core, which we saw early on with Amoonguss, Palafin, Arcanine. It's kind of been shifted where you have the same Amoonguss as the grass type, but Palafin and Arcanine have kind of been combined into Gyarados, who's a water type intimidator, and that lets you use Chi-Yu as the fire type. And basically, like, if you think about the Fire Water Grass core of Palafin, Arcanine, and Amoonguss, you get one pure supporting Pokemon, one like supporting Pokemon that can do some damage in the right context, and then a Pokemon focused on offense. And the roles are the same here, except instead of Palafin doing the damage, it's Chi-Yu. And instead of Arcanine being the bulky support Pokemon, it's the offensive bulky support Pokemon, it's Gyarados. But the advantage of Chi-Yu is that it hits hard immediately, whereas with Palafin, you're forced to switch out. So the defensive core is just really nice. And the nice thing about Gyarados and Amoonguss is that even without Chi-Yu, they're a very strong defensive pairing that can come to, like, either independently or together, they can come to most matchups. Then you have Flutter Mane, who is like the #1 most used Pokemon in the format, if not the best used Pokemon in the format, to give you fast power that also can pair with Chi-Yu, but also benefits from both Intimidate and Rage Powder and Spore support. You have Ting-Lu, who like is just a really solid bulky Pokemon who's really strong into a lot of the like less common matchups. Like Armarouge and Didi has a really hard time with Ting-Lu. Tyranitar plus Lycanroc has a really hard time with Ting-Lu. A lot of like teams that you definitely could play against, but aren't like the most popular. They all struggle a lot with Ting-Lu, especially with like the Gyarados and Amoonguss support. When I was watching Brian play as well, he liked to use Ting-Lu just as a mon in front to kind of sit in front of the opponent and wear them down with like consistent damage like Ruination or like super effective attacks. And then that let him like clean up with his speed boosting Flutter Mane and Specs Chi-Yu later. And then Iron Hands is kind of like also with Swords Dance a Pokemon that can really take advantage of the support from Gyarados and Amoonguss, but it also just really helps with Iron Bundle, who might be a problem otherwise, and like it's good into Dondozo if you have like the proper and it's just overall such a phenomenal Pokemon because of its stats that like also really benefit from Gyarados and Amoonguss. Bit of a long-winded explanation, but basically like the short version is that Gyarados, Amoonguss, Chi-Yu are not only a really solid tight defensive core, but they like allow you to get Gyarados and Amoonguss who then support the other Pokemon in unique and like really valuable ways. So it's just like a composition with a lot of defensive capability that like also is able to do damage and is really like you have tools for most matchups with the specific Pokemon because you have so much synergy and stats. Sorry, I'm not very brief.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's good to get that insight, right? Because it feels like kind of the team to beat right now. The meta is pretty wide open, but in terms of teams that you're going to see more frequently, it feels like a lot of top players. Like I think the fact that you, Paul, Justin, who are 3 of the best players, you know, throughout this season, have all done really well with it recently goes to show that it is a really consistent core. What is interesting about it to me is that there are so many different variations you can run. I've seen different items on all of the Pokemon practically, different sets on the Iron Hands. Obviously, the speed investment on all of the Pokemon make a big deal as well. So with not that many events left in this format, I do think that this team should be on everyone's radar, but clearly it's already been on people's radar and still been performing well, right? So I think it's just a kind of hard core of 6 to break through. But yeah, I mean, James and Rosemary, pivoting to you guys, like looking at the teams from the top 8, what kind of trends do you really draw from this, and what are the main insights that you have from this event?
Yeah, so it just seems like I feel like we're getting a lot of teams that either players are just really comfortable with at this point. For instance, James Evans, who got 2nd place, he's been using this team since EUIC and hasn't really changed too much about it, and he ended up getting 2nd place. He's just very comfortable with the team, and ironically, it also got 8th place by Austin as well. So it's a really strong team. Specs Gholdengo, he's able to put on a lot of pressure, especially with the Tailwind from Talonflame, like we talked about in our previous recaps. Just a really strong combination. Iron Hands, fantastic mod with Assault Vest. Iron Bundle that has been picking up again a lot in usage recently. It's a little bit underrepresented, I think, in this top cut, but it still has 3 placements, still really solid. Even we have a Series 1 team in like 5th place with Palma, Dondozo, Talonflame, Glamour. Like this was like a Series 1 team. Really, it's just like the same team like Chuppa used to get like 2nd at the San Diego Regional Championship, but it's just a Glamour replacing Meowscarada. So players that are comfortable, maybe a few adjustments to teams overall, like we're just seeing that really shine here.
I think one of the things that sticks out to me just from usage in the top 8 is that we're seeing a lot more Gholdengo than we would have previously in some of the other events that we've had for Regulation C. I feel that's a Pokemon that has really started to pick up in popularity, more notably because it's able to put on so much pressure as a fast Pokemon. You could put Choice Scarf on it if you really want to, and it's still able to do some good damage to a Pokemon like Flutter Mane, for example, while also resisting its fairy type attack. So I feel like that is one of the reasons why Gholdengo has been picking up. But then also seeing Dondozo Tatsugiri, you just pointed it out, James, that Rachel actually took that particular combination on this team, and it's still doing really well. Like if you look at the day 2 teams, there are quite a few Dondozo that stick out to me, and it's still a duo that I feel like you have to have on your radar. My attention actually gets drawn outside of the top 8. And Aaron, I'm looking at number 9 here. Ian McLaughlin actually has a Drifblim and Didi, and Peter Chen also made day 2 again with the Halucha.
Yeah, I think these are not meta strategies, right? And there's a reason why no one else is using them, but both Ian and Peter have done well with these cores in different events throughout the season. I think Ian's actually used the same team practically all season, and it's an interesting one because it just relies on a lot of offense. You can lead Tyranitar, Lycanroc, you can go Garchomp, Indeedee. Like, a lot of how he plays is lead Garchomp, Indeedee, sacrifice Indeedee, Swords Dance with Garchomp, bring out Drifbloom, Tailwind, and then sweep with Garchomp and the Flutter Mane. So it kind of goes back to the comfort that James was talking about. Len Duel finished 12th place. He's gotten, I think, like top 8, top 16 at his last 3 regionals, and he's very much realized that he loves this kind of really bulky Tyranitar as well as Garchomp, Corviknight, Lycanroc, and so it's not surprising to see a lot of players here stick to what they know. Yeah, I'm glad you called out Ian's team, seeing him finish 9th and have so much conviction around Drifbloom in particular. The whole season, I think, has been cool. And obviously Peter Chen, who did very well at the Portland Regional Championships, went 8-1 in day 1, rocking Hawlucha and Indeedee. I actually remember seeing a tweet by Peter where he was saying he felt like the format had gotten bulkier, where he wasn't able to just sweep as easily with Hawlucha, which I thought was an interesting maybe comment on where the metagame is headed. Perhaps teams are just getting a little bit bulkier. Going back to the top 8 teams, in my head, there's like 4 different archetypes that really emerge from this top 8, right? The first one is the main team we've been talking about, the Amoonguss, Flutter Mane, Chi-Yu, Gyarados, Iron Hands, Ting Lu team that obviously finished in first place. 3 players in the top 8 had that. 2 players in the top 8 had Dondozo, one being Jishuo Ding, who of course finished 2nd at Portland Regionals. And then we talked about Rochelle, who had, the Series 1 version, which I thought was really interesting. That's 5 of the 8 teams. And then you had Talonflame offense. So James Evans has been one of the biggest pilots of this archetype throughout the season, but we also saw Austin Acosta finish in 8th place with it, using the same 6 Pokemon. Talonflame usage in general feels like it's been picking up a little bit once again. Jesse Romolo in 14th place, for example, rocking it as well. And then, of course, Alex Underhill rocking Orthworm, which isn't a very common archetype, but is still one that, as we were talking about earlier, has a lot of room to go deep. To me, I'd say, like, the main interesting things outside the top 8, or actually just in general, like, lack of weather definitely shocked me a little bit here, because weather felt like the main narrative coming out of the Portland Regional Championships, which was just slightly before this tournament. In that tournament, we had like all the weathers represented. Here, Obama Snow, it feels like it just isn't seen in this top 32 whatsoever. I think there's one player at 49th place with it. They actually had a Titan, which I think is really cool, not Obama Snow bundle. Torkoal, really, I like actually scrolling through all the top 50 teams right now. I'm not sure if I actually spot any, which is really wild to think about, given that it won Portland Regionals. Tyranitar, Lycanroc is seen a fair amount. Tyranitar in particular also just on a bunch of different teams. And then Rain, won regionals over in Europe pretty recently, and it's sitting here at 13th place on Colin Hires team. That team, by the way, I think just one of the strongest teams in the format. Finished 2nd at one of the more recent regionals and has like a really bulky Trick Room Flutter Mane. But overall, I was kind of surprised to see the lack of weather. And then 2, Mousehold Annihilate just like missed out on the top 8 with 2 of the most notable players this season. Nick, aka Nails, as well as Zachary Thornburg running the same 6. And they used Mouse Ape with Screamtail in particular. So those are just some of the interesting trends that I noted. I felt like coming out of this event in particular, but curious what you all think.
I think it's also something that's interesting to me. That's a great analysis, Aaron. I think that there's kind of 2 things that jump out at me looking at the top 50 and then the top 8. I think, Rose, you just mentioned this, but there's so many Gholdengo, like in a way that's almost like shocking to me, because I feel like Gholdengo, the thing is that all the new Ruin Pokemon are dark type. So Pokemon that are weak to dark, I think, had a hard time, and like Chi-Yu and Ting Lu both having both stabs, not that it, Ting Lu normally runs a dark stab, but like having both stabs be able to hit Gholdengo for super effective damage, it fell out of usage like really quickly. And all of a sudden it feels like it's back in a big way. We saw James Evans with the spec set. I think that Rain team that you were mentioning, Aaron, with the Pelipper, normally runs Choice Scarf Gholdengo. Yeah, so that's just interesting to me. But the other thing is that in the top 8, unless I'm counting wrong, I think that there are more Iron Hands than there are Flutter Mane, which is shocking to me, because Flutter Mane has been the Pokemon. It's on 74% of teams in the top 50 and 66% of all total teams, whereas Iron Hands is only on 27% of all total teams. So the fact that Iron Hands outplace Flutter Mane is, I think, very interesting.
Yeah, it's 6 Iron Hands and 5 Flutter Mane.
It makes sense. Like, Iron Hands has the best stats of any Paradox Pokemon, in my opinion, because although it sacrifices speed, it just has everything else in abundance. So the fact that it's like finally picking up in usage, I'm not shocked by, but it is a very good Pokemon. Like, it's basically used on about like less than half of the amount of teams that Flutter Mane is, and it outperforms it in the top 8. I think that's like probably something that players should be aware of. It also helps that there's no alternative, right? If you want ghost type damage, you can get that from like Gholdengo, but if you want electric type damage, like there's not really a good alternative to Iron Hand, in my opinion.
I think what's interesting about it is we saw it a lot on stream, a lot of people using these Swords Dance sets, and one other meta adaptation that we've talked about before is the rise of Clear Smog on Amoonguss, and I think most of the Amoongusses I saw in the top 8 had Clear Smog. There are actually a lot of games on stream where you'd have an Iron Hand trying to set up in front of Amoonguss, and it's like, I've got safety goggles, you can't really do anything to me, I'm just gonna click Swords Dance, but then it would just get Clear Smog and all that work would kind of be negated. I thought just one interesting move trend on Amoonguss in particular, and primarily used as an answer for Dondozo, just because most Dondozos out there aren't Substitute, for example, or Steel Terra, so pretty easy to get rid of the boosts. It's also very helpful against things like the Iron Hands as well as Dragon Dance Dragonite, which ended up finishing in 3rd place. So I feel like when Iron Hands was first used, most players were defaulting to the Assault Vest set, and now people have realized that Swords Dance makes it really strong. I'm now curious how those teams will adapt to Clear Smog Amoonguss in particular. I don't think Clear Smog Amoonguss alone is such a big threat to it, where it's like you need a definitive counter to it, but I just thought it was interesting because it felt like half the games I watched on stream, I saw Amoonguss get rid of stat boosts.
Yeah, I've also noticed that, and that was also a trend in Europe where they also ran a bunch of Clear Smog Amoonguss. Definitely seems helpful, especially with like all the setup recently with safety goggles. We've seen the Iron Hands. Of course, you might not want to leave an Amoonguss in against the Chi-Yu. Some of them run the safety goggles nasty plot as well, but it just seems nice because a lot of these Pokemon that have safety goggles seem to have like some sort of setup move. So even if you can't put them to sleep, you can at least get rid of their boosts. And that's something I think that Amoonguss has been trending up. It's also, of course, nice against Dondozo and a few other factors. There's some side Clear Smog plays you can do to get rid of Intimidate, with like Gyarados becoming one of the more common Pokemon, I think, in the format, just rising up in usage a lot. So there's a lot of cool ways you can utilize Clear Smog Amoonguss on teams.
I have a question for you all. Why do you think Torkoal just isn't in this field at all? Like the fact there's no Torkoal in the top 50 is actually shocking to me, and I'm curious if you all have any hypotheses for why that's the case.
I think Torkoal's like kind of hard to use because like a lot of the success that people have had with Torkoal is like the eject pack set, which like isn't inherently bad, but is kind of abusable. Like I had a match in Hartford where my opponent had like Lilligant Torkoal on the field, and I switched in Gyarados, forced them out of Torkoal, and flamethrowed that slot with Goggles Chi-Yu, and they switched in Great Tusk, and like it fainted, and I just won the game immediately. I mean, the set that won Portland had Fissure, right? Like it was like Fissure, Overheat, Yawn, I believe, or maybe Helping Hand, or maybe both.
Yeah, it was Fissure, Helping Hand, Overheat, Protect.
And so like it's like, I'm not gonna say it's like a bad Pokemon, but like in the past when Torkoal's had success, it's kind of been the focus with like Eruption and Trick Room, whereas here it's like enabling the partners. And I think Chi-Yu with its like pretty intense special bulk, and then Gyarados with its really good matchup against Great Tusk, both kind of invalidate a lot of the stronger photosynthesis Pokemon that Torkoal would take advantage of. Giving opposing Chi-Yu the sun, especially if they're like choice specs, like a lot of them are, is just really, really dangerous. And also a lot of the Torkoal players run Dumpluff or Lilligant, which is just like an inherently inconsistent Pokemon where like if you have a bad day with Sleep Powder, you're probably just like not gonna do super well. So I think it's inherently a volatile archetype, coupled with the fact that I don't think it matches up super well into Chi-Yu or Gyarados or Terrafire Iron Hands for that matter, that I think just makes it not in a very good spot personally.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the other thing about it that I feel like is an interesting consideration to make is not just for any of the fire type attackers that are in the meta, but also just photosynthesis in general. One of the issues that I personally had running Torkoal is that it's really difficult to position it well in order for your team to capitalize on it and not the other players. If you're not a good enough player, I feel like that can be something that can come back to bite you. And we've actually seen this happen a couple of times on stream, where one player will actually set the sun, and then all of a sudden, the opponent on the other side is getting all of these photosynthesis boosts, and everything is just kind of getting out of control. And especially if it's like a Torkoal that, let's say that's like your last Pokemon, right? Or one of your last two. You don't have the ability anymore to actually switch it around so that it's not doing negative things for your team. And I think that's also why we've pivoted away from Torkoal specifically, and we're seeing more of these prankster setups with, like, there's a couple of Murkrow. We talked about this in the last video, that Murkrow is starting to rise again in popularity, and with just manual set of Sunny Day.
I think also Terra Water is the most used Terra type as well, like, or at least in the top, actually, yeah, in both the general field and in the top 50, and especially Ting Lu has stopped running Terra Poison, has started running Terra Water, which, like, when we think about kind of Torkoal, Flutter Mane, and Great Tusk, it's really, like, Great Tusk hitting both Flutter Mane and Torkoal for super effective damage, and then no longer being weak to Flutter Mane or Great Tusk while also resisting Torkoal, I think just makes it, like, a really good Pokemon against that kind of archetype. So that's like something else that I think is like relevant in the discussion.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well. Like if we compared the usage stats of Hartford, like I think something that's always been on the rise recently has been like this Chi-Yu Flutter Mane combo, especially. It's probably one of the top pairs actually at the regional championship, and something that went down a lot, I think, which was interesting. Not only just weather, even though we didn't see in the top 8, I mean, we still see Dragonite, Chi, and Pal. There's actually 3 in top 16, and I just thought it was pretty interesting not seeing a single one really in the top 8. I was wondering how y'all thought about like is it still good, especially because maybe Orthworm is something that gives that duo a lot of trouble, or a lot of teams, as we've seen before, especially like that one stream match at Hartford.
Totally, yeah. I think the last thing I want to touch on is just some of the unique sets that came out of this event. Overall, I'd say most of the top teams weren't super surprising. We had some relatively underrepresented picks. Alex Underhill running Gothitelle and Orthworm, for example. We had the Palmod in 5th place, the Driftblum in 9th place, Lendual using that Corviknight as well. But of course, there's some Pokemon that you just so rarely see, and when they do make an appearance, I think it really is interesting. In 18th place, Giovanni ran Magnezone, which is a Pokemon that I had not really seen throughout this season at all. So for those wondering, the Magnezone was a Water Terra Analytics Citrus Berry set with Flash Cannon, Protect, Helping Hand, and Thunderbolt. The idea is obviously you're going to be able to do a lot of damage just with Analytic, but Helping Hand's really nice. We talk about Palafin kind of decreasing in popularity, but this team actually did have Palafin as well as Specs Flutter and a Fire Terra Baxcalibur, as well as a Flying Terra Arcanine, so you can Flying Terra next to Baxcalibur EQ, and then with Arcanine you had Howl as well. So the idea is a lot of physical attackers, Brute Bonnet as well, by the way, and then Magnezone can further increase their damage output while also being able to take attacks decently from something like Flutter Mane. And then Gary Chian had a really interesting team with Indeedee Armarouge. That duel's obviously fallen off a cliff, but still represented here on this team. And then Choice Scarf Crocodile, as well as Whiterb Shell Smash Dreadnought. Both of those Pokemon I feel like have seen very little play throughout the season, and seeing both of them on the same team, it definitely drew my eye personally. And then there was a Cetidon here as well, finishing in 49th place, and that was an Assault Vest Slush Rust set. So it's funny, we were talking about weather earlier, and I was like, would not have expected more Abomasnow Cetidons than Abomasnow Iron Bundles, but somehow here we are. So those were the main Pokemon that caught my eye. I feel like we just never really see, so I'm curious if there are any other specific Pokemon or teams that you guys were drawn to.
I mean, it's kind of interesting seeing 2 Hawluchas in the, well, I guess top 65, because one of them placed in the 65th with like Tinkaton and Serena with Grimmsnarl, which is, I think it was the, if I'm not mistaken, that I'll double check the paste right now, but it was, I think, like there was a Mirror Herb and some really cool text. Yeah, it was a Swagger Grimmsnarl with Lumberry, Hawlucha, and a Mirror Herb Serena, which I thought was like really cool. That team got 65th, and yeah, it's definitely a unique twist. But really, I think I've seen this team before on ladder, so I think players again are just using like what they're comfortable with. There's some who like use what's good in the meta, what they think can help out with like maybe some text, or just like things to catch your opponent off guard because they might not know the matchup nearly as well as you do.
I think that's why actually Alex Underhill's team sticks out to me. It's not the Orthworm that my eye gets drawn to, it's the Gothitelle. Alex Underhill was the only player to bring Gothitelle into day number 2 and ended up making top 4 with it. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on whether or not you think that Gothitelle would end up being a Pokemon again that people kind of need to keep an eye on, because it was successful towards the beginning part of Scarlet and Violet.
I think Gothitelle's like really hard to use. I mean, I'm a big Gothitelle believer myself. Like it's one of my favorite Pokemon to use, and it's very strong, but like it's so hard to use because it's, God, it's like, because it creates just such unique game states, and because it can only have 4 moves. Like, I'm not actually sure. Do you all know what moves Alex was running on his Goth?
It was Psychic.
Steel Pulse, Fake Out, Trick Room, Psychic. So
no
Protect.
Oh my god, yeah, that's no Protect is wild. Okay, yeah, interesting. Yeah, Gothitelle's just like, I actually like, as a big Gothitelle believer, I don't really get it on Alex's team. I mean, I guess it gives him the Trick Room option, which you can use with like Hands and Tinglu and stuff. Yeah, that's very, very interesting to me. I think Gothitelle's like super strong. It doesn't fit on every team, and it like kind of needs the right Pokemon around it to really make it work, in my opinion at least. I definitely think we could see more Gothitelle. I definitely think it's a great Pokemon, but I don't think it will ever become commonplace just because it's so difficult to not only to use, but also to like build a team that makes full use of its capabilities, right? Because if the opponent doesn't want to switch out in the first place, then Shadow Tag doesn't really help you that much. And it's not like Gothitelle is often like doing the threatening itself. Like Gothitelle's mostly there just keeping them trapped in with the partner. So that's why it's so difficult to really build around, because you basically have to have a team where you can put something next to Gothitelle and really take advantage of the fact that the opponents are trapped in. Otherwise, like there's not really much point in using it, you know?
Yeah, also the fact that Flutter Mane is still on so many different teams and it naturally can switch out a Shadow Tag and hit Goth for super effective, it just makes it difficult to use in general. We've been talking about the rise of Gholdengo as well, and I can't imagine that makes Gothitelle's life easier either. So the fact that a lot of meta teams are running two Pokemon that give Gothitelle a lot of trouble makes it harder to execute. It's one of those really high skill cap Pokemon, but I think if you're team building, you don't need to go out of your way to like prepare for this in particular. It's once again not really represented that much in the metagame, but you should at least be prepared and think about, okay, if I do run into a Gothitelle, how am I going to lead against this so I don't just get crushed immediately? Because one of the easiest ways you can lose against Gothitelle, in my opinion, is you have a poor lead, your opponent just gets 2 knockouts because you can't really take advantage of switching, and then things devolve from there. I did think it was interesting. Paul Chu, I believe, was running the Assault Vest Volt Switch Iron Hands rather than the Sword Stance set, and so that allowed him to actually break through Alex's trap with Gothitelle fairly easily. Because he had Volt Switch to get out around the trap and clear Smog Amoonguss, I think Alex was like constantly positioning Gothitelle in hands to try to set up with Sword Stance, and Sword Stance looked really good into Paul's team, but then you would like all the boosts would just be negated with the Amoonguss, and their set in particular was really interesting, where games went on for a super long time and it didn't feel like there was really much happening the entire time, and like the damage kind of just slowly got choked out. It was like very little damage coming out turn by turn, but Alex just didn't really have too many options. So that was an interesting set to see kind of how you break through the setup of Gothis as well as Orthworm. And then Paul's actually also had leftovers on the Tinglu, which I thought was interesting. I think we've seen Assault Vest a lot throughout the season, and then we've seen other items pick up in usage, but leftovers plus protect plus the Amoonguss with Pollen Puff made it really difficult to break through, and it seemed like a lot of teams struggled against that in particular. But yeah, I just thought about that from watching the stream game. Yeah, I think those are all the main thoughts I had. So I think as we wrap up here, any final concluding thoughts from you all?
Yeah, so I
Alex Underkillers.
So true.
I guess it's just the meta's continuing to evolve. We're seeing like maybe some niche picks in order to help out like players' play style, because Alex has been always a big fan of Shadow Tag. He was a huge fan of Mega Gengar back in Generation 7. So I think just as the teams evolve to the players' comfort, we're seeing these changes. Like for instance, the standard 6 that we've been talking about, the Tinglu, Chiyu, Flutter, Gyarados, Iron Hands, and Amoonguss. We've seen a lot of different sets according to the player's preference. Like Wolfey used that tournament, had completely different sets to Brian, who had completely different sets to Paul. There are many different ways you could run a team, eras, items, and it really just depends on like what you envision how the Mon works on a team. And I think it just makes it super flexible. We're seeing players just utilize teams that like are to their strengths, and I think we see that a lot. Like the Dondozo, for instance, we've seen 2 different versions of Dondozo. One has like this really offensive mode with Zisho Ding, and then the other one is a bit different from Rusho, which has more of a tailwind offense style. But I think overall it's just like players, as we get to NIC in the last couple of events, are just trying to make the best of their teams, utilizing it to the best of their strengths.
I'm ready to see Wo-Chien win a regional. Fresno.
I'm not Wo-Chien.
Fresno, it's the time. It's the time. What do you mean?
I'm not. I can't do Tapu Bulu again. I've been hurt too much.
All right, well, I think that's going to be it from us. So lots of interesting metagame developments continue to happen here in Regulation C. We've only got a couple of big tournaments left in this format. Of course, Fresno Regionals taking place at the end of this weekend, and North American Internationals as well. And of course, afterwards, we'll switch over to the Regulation D rule set, which is just going to introduce pure chaos. We, of course, did a video talking about that as well, so don't forget to check that out. But thanks for joining us here at Beastcoast Pokemon. Don't forget to leave a like, give us any feedback, subscribe to the channel. We're really, really excited to break down the rest of the season for you all. And yeah, good luck with Regulation C and preparing for Regulation D as we head into the final few months of this season.